Everyone in town knew Old Joe was a monster. He lived alone on the blackened ruins of his home, and every day they all saw how he tormented his black cat, tying it to a post with a short rope under the blazing sun. But one night, a young volunteer named Maya, unable to stand it any longer, decided to act. She crept into the ruins with wire cutters in her pocket, ready to cut the rope and steal the animal away to give it a new life. She thought she was there to save a victim, but she was about to find the truth, which was more heartbreaking and terrible than anything they could imagine. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning. The house was a skeleton of black wood against the gray sky, a scar on the edge of the pleasant town. In the center of the ruin sat Old Joe, a man with a face like thunder and clothes stained with soot. But the neighbors didn't stare at him. They stared at the animal beside him. It was a black cat, missing one ear, tied to a burnt beam with a rope so short it could barely move. From a distance, Joe looked like part of the ruin himself. His shoulders were slumped forward, but his jaw was set like hard stone. In one hand, he held a thick wooden stick, resting it against the ground. To anyone watching, it looked like a weapon, ready to be used. He never seemed to sleep, never seemed to leave. He was just always there, a silent, angry king on a throne of ash. The cat was just as still. Its black fur was dull and patchy, with thin white scars showing through on its back and sides. The missing ear made its head look unbalanced and strange. It sat with a kind of heavy patience, as if it had been waiting for something for a very long time. The rope around its neck was thick and dirty, and it was tied so tightly to the beam that the cat had no freedom at all. Suddenly, Joe moved. He gave the rope a sharp, deliberate tug. The cat, which had been leaning slightly to one side, was pulled back to its original spot. It made no sound, just resettled itself. A car driving by slowed down, and the driver, a woman with wide, horrified eyes, shook her head and sped away. She had seen exactly what she expected to see, an act of casual cruelty. This was the story the town told itself about Old Joe. "Don't get too close to the fence," mothers would tell their children as they hurried past. "That's Mad Joe. He lost his mind in the fire." The tragedy of the house fire, which had happened almost a year ago, was no longer a source of sympathy. It was now just the origin story of the local monster. People had forgotten the smell of smoke that had hung over the neighborhood for weeks. They had forgotten the sirens and the terrible orange glow in the night sky. Now, the ruin was just an ugly problem, and Joe was the angry ghost who refused to leave it. He was a problem to be solved, not a person to be helped. The sun moved across the sky, and a small patch of warmth touched the ground just beyond the cat's reach. The animal shifted, stretching its neck towards the light. Again, Joe saw the movement. Again, he gave the rope a firm pull, bringing the cat back into the shade of the burnt beam. From the street, it looked like he was denying the animal even this small comfort. The normal sounds of the town seemed to stop at the edge of the ruin. Laughter from a nearby park, the cheerful jingle of an ice cream truck, the barking of a happy dog. All of it felt like it belonged to a different world. Inside the blackened foundation, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the empty window frames. Why didn't he just untie the poor thing? People would ask each other. Why keep it there, tied up in the dirt and the rain? The answer seemed obvious. He was a bitter, broken man, and he was taking his anger out on the only living thing that couldn't escape him. It was a simple and terrible explanation, and everyone in town believed it. A pickup truck rattled to a stop by the curb. A young man leaned out the window and shouted, "Hey, leave that cat alone, you freak." Joe didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. He just pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, as if the words themselves were a cold wind. The truck squealed its tires and drove away. As evening approached, the sky turned a soft purple and the air grew cold. The cat shivered, pressing itself against the hard wood of the beam for warmth. Joe sat beside it, unmoving, his face hidden in the growing shadows. He was going to leave it out all night, people thought. He was going to let it freeze. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, strange shadows across the debris. Lights in the neighboring houses turned on, showing families gathering for dinner in their warm, safe kitchens. Soon, the street was quiet and empty. The whole world had gone inside, leaving the old man and the tethered cat alone in the cold darkness. Passers-by shook their heads in disgust as they walked their dogs on the other side of the street. They saw a madman tormenting a helpless creature in the heat. But nobody looked close enough to see that the old man's hands were gentle when he checked the knot, or to hear him whispering soft apologies to the scared animal. The video spread through the internet like wildfire, titled, "Monster Tortures Cat in Ruins." Strangers began to gather at the fence, shouting angry words and throwing small stones at the old man. But they missed something important in their anger. Every time a stone flew, Joe didn't run. He leaned over the trembling cat, using his own broken back as a shield against the hate. It had been filmed that afternoon by a teenager on his phone. The footage was shaky and zoomed in, making everything look worse than it was. The rope looked like a chain. The cat's stillness looked like terror. Joe's tired face looked like pure evil. Below the video, the comments section was a river of poison. "Someone needs to rescue that poor baby," one person wrote. "I hope he rots," said another. "Why haven't the police done anything?" The digital anger did not stay online for long. By mid-morning the next day, a small group of people had gathered at the broken fence. They held their phones up, filming their own videos, narrating their own outrage. "We're here live," a young woman said into her phone, "at the House of Horrors where this sicko is torturing a cat. We are demanding justice." Joe did not respond to their shouts or their cameras. He sat in his usual spot, staring at nothing, as if the crowd wasn't even there. His silence was like gasoline on a fire. To the growing mob, it was not the quiet of grief. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he was above the law. They wanted him to scream, to cry, to confess. He did nothing. Then the first stone was thrown. It was just a small pebble, and it landed harmlessly in the dirt a few feet away from him. But it was a beginning. A line had been crossed. The crowd felt a surge of power. They were no longer just observers. They were participants. Soon, more stones followed, bigger this time. One skittered across the ground and hit the wooden beam, making a loud crack. The black cat flinched violently at the sound, its body tensing with fear. It tried to scramble away, but the rope held it fast. The crowd cheered, feeling they had finally gotten a reaction. Then came the moment that would be replayed in a dozen more videos. A larger rock flew through the air, aimed directly at the cat. But before it could land, Joe moved with a speed that seemed impossible for his age. He threw himself over the small animal, covering it completely with his own body. The rock hit him squarely in the back with a heavy, sickening thud. He didn't cry out. He just absorbed the blow. The crowd didn't see an act of protection. They saw a man trying to hide his victim. "He's covering it up," someone yelled, convinced they were witnessing proof of his guilt. The logic was twisted, but in their anger, it made perfect sense. The man was shielding the evidence of his crime. A police car finally arrived, its siren off, but its blue and red lights flashing silently. A tired-looking officer got out and held up his hands. "All right, folks, break it up," he said, his voice flat. "Go on home. We're aware of the situation." He glanced at Joe, then back at the crowd. He was treating it like a noise complaint, not a rescue mission. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. They grumbled with dissatisfaction, promising to be back, promising that this wasn't over. As the last car drove away, the silence that fell over the ruin felt heavy and dangerous. The peace was gone. Now, the place felt like a battlefield. Joe waited until he was completely alone before he moved. He pushed himself up slowly, his face tight with pain from the bruise on his back. He didn't check his own injury. Instead, he reached down and ran a trembling hand over the cat's fur, checking every inch of it, whispering, "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" The cat, sensing the danger had passed, leaned into his touch and purred softly. From a hidden pocket, Joe pulled out a small, single-serving can of tuna. The sound of the metal tab pulling open was loud in the evening quiet. He carefully spooned half of the fish onto a clean piece of broken tile and pushed it towards the cat. Only after the cat began to eat did Joe lift the can to his own mouth, eating the rest in 2 quick bites. It was their ritual, a shared meal at the end of another terrible day. As the sun went down, the crowd finally left, leaving Joe alone in the silence. He opened a single can of tuna and placed it in front of the cat, not taking a bite for himself. He stroked the cat's scarred back and sighed. "Just one more day, buddy," he murmured to the darkness. "They don't understand, but we can't leave yet." Maya, a young volunteer with a brave heart, decided she could not wait for the police. Under the cover of a moonless night, she climbed over the broken fence with wire cutters in her pocket. The ruins were silent, smelling of wet ash and old sorrow. When she reached the center, she froze. The monster was fast asleep, and the cat was curled up tightly against his chest. She had spent the whole day watching the online comments grow more and more hateful. She had called animal control, the police, and even the mayor's office. Everyone gave her the same answer: "We are aware of the situation, and we are monitoring it." Monitoring it wasn't enough. Maya believed that when an animal was suffering, every minute counted. She had to do something herself. So she waited until the streetlights painted long, lonely stripes across her bedroom wall. Then she dressed in dark clothes, grabbed her emergency rescue kit, and slipped out of her house. In her mind, she was on a mission. She was the one person brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to step in where everyone else was just watching. The heavy wire cutters in her backpack felt like a symbol of her purpose. She parked her old car 3 streets away and walked the rest of the way, her sneakers making soft sounds on the pavement. The neighborhood was asleep. Warm light glowed behind drawn curtains. It felt wrong that so much peace could exist right next to such misery. When she reached the jagged outline of the burnt house, she took a deep breath and found a low spot in the fence to climb over. The moment her feet touched the ground inside the property, the world changed. The air was colder here, and the smell of old fire was thick and sad. She moved carefully through the debris, her small flashlight beam dancing over piles of broken bricks and twisted, melted metal. It was a dangerous maze, a graveyard of a family's life. With every step, a piece of glass crunched under her shoe. She followed the path of flattened dirt that Joe must walk every day. It led towards the center of the ruins, to the dark shape of the main support beam. Her heart was beating a fast, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was ready for a confrontation, She imagined the old man shouting, maybe even swinging his stick at her. She was prepared to be quick, to cut the rope and run with the cat in her arms, but there was no confrontation. There was only silence. As she got closer, her flashlight beam found them. Joe was slumped against the beam, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open in a deep, exhausted sleep. And there, curled into a perfect ball on his lap, was the black cat. The animal's head was tucked under Joe's chin, and one of the old man's hands rested gently on its back. This was not what she expected. The image on the internet was one of a monster and his victim. But this looked like peace. It looked like comfort. For a long moment, Maya just stood there, hidden in the shadows, her plan suddenly feeling clumsy and wrong. The cat wasn't straining against the rope. It was sleeping, safe and warm against the very person she had come to save it from. She felt a flicker of doubt. Could the whole town be wrong? Could the videos be missing something important? She remembered the angry comments, the stones being thrown. She remembered the sharp tug on the rope she had seen in the video. No, she told herself. A kind man doesn't tie an animal to a post. This moment of peace must be an accident, a brief pause in a long story of cruelty. She took another silent step forward. She could see Joe's face clearly now in the soft light of her flashlight. It wasn't the face of a monster. It was just the face of an old man, deeply wrinkled and etched with a sadness so profound it seemed to be carved into his bones. His clothes were torn and dirty, but the hand resting on the cat was clean. The cat's one good ear twitched. Its head lifted slowly, and it looked directly at Maya. It didn't hiss. It didn't spit or try to run. It just watched her with a calm, quiet intensity. Its stillness was unnerving. Joe didn't stir. It was just her and the cat, two strangers meeting in the ruins of a forgotten life. This was her chance. She could be quiet. She could be quick. Her resolve hardened again. Whatever the story was here, the rope was real. The imprisonment was real. That was a fact she could change. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, hard steel of the cutters. She crept closer, her heart beating fast in her chest. She told herself she was a hero. She was going to liberate this poor animal, even if she had to fight the crazy old man to do it. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the sharp cutters, and opened the blades, ready to cut the rope. Maya reached out to cut the rope, but the cat lifted its head, and her heart stopped. In the beam of her flashlight, the animal's eyes were cloudy and white. He was completely blind. Then she looked down at the ground. Just inches from the cat's paws, the floor ended in a jagged drop straight into a flooded basement full of sharp metal. Everything happened in a single, silent second. The flashlight beam, which had been aimed at the rope, moved just a few inches higher, illuminating the cat's face. The eyes didn't reflect the light back at her. They were like two small, milky pearls, beautiful but completely unseeing. A blind cat. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of this new information. A blind cat wouldn't know where it was going. It could wander into danger. It could get lost. It could fall. Her gaze instinctively dropped from the cat's eyes, following the short length of the rope down to the wooden beam. And then she saw it. It wasn't just a beam. It was a bridge. On either side, the floor of the house was gone, having collapsed into the darkness below. The beam was the only solid thing in a 10-foot radius, and just where the cat sat, inches from its front paws, was the edge of that darkness. She pointed her flashlight down into the hole. The beam cut through the blackness and revealed a terrible sight, a pit of stagnant, oily water filled with sharp, twisted rebar and broken concrete. It was a death trap. Suddenly, the video she had seen made a new, horrifying kind of sense. The sharp tug on the rope. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of rescue. Joe hadn't been pulling the cat back from comfort. He had been pulling it back from the brink of a fatal fall. Every single day, he was tethering the blind animal to the only safe spot, a lifeline disguised as a chain. The weight of her misunderstanding was crushing. She and the entire town, and thousands of strangers on the internet, had judged a man without knowing a single true thing about his life. They had called him a monster for performing an act of constant, vigilant love. They had thrown stones at a man who was using his own body as a shield. Maya dropped the cutters. They clattered on the stone, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet night. She felt a wave of cold shame wash over her. She had come to save a victim, but she was looking at two survivors. The rope wasn't a chain of cruelty. It was the only thing keeping the blind cat from falling into the abyss. The loud noise finally woke Joe. He jolted upright with a gasp, his eyes wide with fear. His first instinct was not to look at Maya, but to check on the cat, pulling it closer to his chest. Only then did his gaze lock onto her. He saw the flashlight, the dark clothes, the cutters lying on the ground. His face hardened with a fear she now understood. He thought she was here to hurt them. He lunged forward and grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, a bony, desperate clamp. He didn't say a word, just held her there, his chest heaving. His eyes pleaded with her, a silent, terrified message. Please don't hurt him. He is all I have left. Maya didn't pull away. She deserved this. She let him hold her, letting him feel that she was not a threat. She was the intruder, the fool who had mistaken a guardian for a jailer. The power dynamic had completely flipped. She was not here to save anyone. If anything, she was the one who needed saving from her own ignorance. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know. I saw the video. I thought." She couldn't finish the sentence. How could she explain the arrogance of her certainty? Joe stared at her for a long moment. He looked from her tear-streaked face to the wire cutters on the ground, and then to the deep, dark hole beside the beam. He saw the understanding dawning in her expression. The hardness in his own face began to soften, replaced by a wave of bone-deep weariness. His grip on her wrist loosened. She finally pulled her arm back, rubbing the spot where his fingers had been. She looked from the old man to the blind cat, and then back to the terrifying drop into the basement. The simple story of good versus evil had shattered into a million complicated pieces. This wasn't cruelty. This was a promise, kept in the ruins of a broken heart. Joe woke with a start, gripping Maya's wrist, but there was no anger in his tired eyes, only tears. In a voice as dry as dust, he whispered the secret that was killing him. The cat was not a prisoner. He was a guardian, sitting exactly above the spot where Joe's granddaughter's favorite doll was buried under the rubble. The cat had tried to save the girl from the fire, and now he refused to leave her memory behind. He let go of her wrist, and the fight seemed to drain out of him completely. He sagged back against the beam, a man held up only by the weight of his own sorrow. Maya didn't move. She just stood there in the quiet darkness, her flashlight beam aimed at the ground, giving them a small circle of light in the vast ruin. The fire. It was so fast, Joe began, his voice raspy from disuse. One minute, we were all asleep. The next, the whole world was smoke and noise. He looked away, his eyes staring at a memory only he could see. I tried to get to her. My Lily. She was 7. He choked on the word, a small, painful sound. The smoke was too thick. The floor gave way. I couldn't reach her room. He paused, taking a shaky breath before he continued. Her cat, Ash, was in there with her. She had found him a few months before, a tiny little thing abandoned in a storm drain. She saved him. She loved him more than anything. Joe reached down and stroked the cat's head, and the animal leaned into his touch, a silent confirmation of the story. When the firefighters pulled me out, I was burned, he said, gesturing to the faint scars on his hands and neck. But Ash, he was burned worse. The vet said the heat and smoke damaged his eyes. That's why he can't see. He looked at the cat with an expression of profound respect. They found him next to Lily's bed. He hadn't tried to run. He had been trying to wake her up. His paws were raw from scratching at her blankets. Now Maya understood the scars on the cat's back, the missing ear. They were not signs of a hard life on the streets. They were the medals of a tiny, failed hero. He had stayed by his person's side until the very end. "They found Lily," Joe whispered, his voice breaking. But her room collapsed into the basement before they could recover everything. And her doll, a little raggedy thing she called Sunshine, it was still in there. It was the last thing she was holding when I tucked her into bed that night. He looked at Maya, his eyes pleading for her to understand. The city wants to bulldoze everything. They say it's just trash, but it's not trash to me, and it's not trash to him. He pointed a trembling finger at the ground directly in front of the cat. "That's her room down there. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows. He sits here all day, every day, right above where she is, or where she was." The pieces all clicked into place for Maya, forming a picture of love so fierce and loyal it was almost unbearable. The man and the cat were bound together not by a rope, but by a shared sacred duty. They were standing vigil. They were waiting for a piece of their family to come home. "I tried to get him to leave," Joe said, his voice barely audible. "I bought a little apartment. I tried to carry him away, but he fights. He cries. He won't eat. He just wants to come back here. He thinks he's still on duty. And I can't. I can't leave him to do it alone." Maya looked at the blind cat, who was now sniffing the air in her direction, his head tilted curiously. He was not a prisoner. He was a sentry, guarding a memory buried in the darkness below. And the old man, the world called a monster, was his partner, his protector, his only friend. "She is gone," Joe said, wiping his dirty face with a sleeve. "But he remembers her smell. He won't move until we find the last thing she held. If I drag him away now, his heart will break. And mine will too." He looked at the cat, who was sniffing the air, searching for a scent that was buried deep under the bricks. The morning sun brought the roar of heavy engines instead of birdsong. 2 massive yellow bulldozers rolled up to the property line, sent by the city to clear the dangerous trash. Joe scrambled to his feet, grabbing his wooden stick. He stood between the giant machines and his blind friend, looking small and fragile, but ready to fight the whole world. After Joe's story, Maya had stayed with him until the sky began to turn from black to a soft, bruised purple. They had shared a granola bar from her backpack in silence. For the first time, Joe had a guest in his broken home. But the fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of the demolition crew. The machines were like 2 giant yellow beasts, growling and impatient. A man in a hard hat and a bright orange vest climbed down from the cab of the lead bulldozer. He held a clipboard and walked with an air of official importance. "Morning," he said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. "Joseph Miller? I've got a court order here for the immediate demolition of this structure. It's been declared a public hazard." "You can't," Joe said, his voice stronger than Maya had heard it before. He planted his stick in the dirt like a flag. "This is my property. You can't just tear it down." "Sir, it stopped being your property when it became a danger to the neighborhood," the foreman replied, his patience already wearing thin. "We've sent you a dozen notices. You have 1 hour to remove any personal belongings and vacate the premises." Maya stepped forward. "Please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's a situation here you don't understand. We just need more time. We need to get something out from under the rubble." The foreman glanced at her, then back at Joe, then at the cat tied to the beam. He sighed, a long, tired sound. "Lady, I just drive the machine. My orders are to clear this lot by noon. What you do is your business, but at 9 o'clock, we start." He tapped his clipboard. It's all official. He didn't care about their story. To him, this was just another job, another pile of rubble to be cleared away. The grief, the loyalty, the blind cat guarding a memory. None of it mattered in the face of a signed work order. He represented a world that ran on schedules and paperwork, a world that had no time for broken hearts. Joe stood his ground, his knuckles white on his stick. "You'll have to go through me," he said quietly. The foreman just shook his head and walked back to his machine, shouting instructions to the other driver. The sound of the engines grew louder, a deafening roar that made the ground vibrate. Ash, the blind cat, flattened himself against the beam, his body trembling with terror from the noise and the shaking earth he could not understand. He let out a low, mournful cry. Maya's heart pounded. This couldn't be happening. She looked at Joe, a frail old man preparing to fight a 10-ton machine. She looked at the terrified cat, and she looked at the rubble, knowing that a little girl's last treasure was about to be crushed into dust and hauled away like garbage. There was no time to reason, no time to appeal. The system was in motion, and it was about to destroy everything. The foreman leaned out of the cab and blew the horn, a loud, angry sound that made the ground shake. "Move it, old-timer," he yelled. "We have a schedule to keep." The giant metal scoop began to lift into the air, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the man and the cat. It seemed like the end. Before the machines could move, Maya ran forward, holding her phone high in the air. She wasn't filming the bulldozers, she was live streaming to the angry crowd online. "Look," she said, her voice shaking as she zoomed in on the dangerous hole in the blind cat's white eyes. "He isn't hurting him. He is saving him from falling. And they are both waiting for a goodbye." Her mind was racing. There was no time to write a sign or make a phone call. The only weapon she had was the same one that had caused all this pain: the internet. She opened the same social media app where the first video had gone viral. A red button glowed on her screen. Go live. She pressed it without a second thought. Her face appeared on screens across the town and beyond. She looked frantic, her hair a mess, but her eyes were filled with a desperate clarity. "Everyone who saw the video of Mad Joe, you need to see this," she began, her voice loud and clear over the rumbling engine. "You have the story wrong. We all had it wrong." She turned the phone's camera around. First, she focused on Joe, who was standing frozen between her and the giant machine, his stick held in front of him like a useless shield. Then, she moved the camera to Ash, the blind cat, who was cowering against the beam. She pushed the zoom in, making sure everyone could see the milky, unseeing eyes. "This is Ash," she said, "and he is completely blind." A stream of comments began to fly up the side of her screen. Most were still full of hate and confusion. "Liar! He's a monster," one read. "That's just a trick of the light," said another. Maya ignored them. She took a step closer, lowering the phone to show them the real danger. "And this," she said, pointing the camera into the dark, jagged hole in the ground, "is why he is tied up." The phone's light cut through the shadows, revealing the pit of twisted metal and dark water below. "The rope isn't a prison, it's a safety line. Without it, Ash would have fallen in and died a long time ago." She panned the camera back up, her own face now filling the screen again. Her voice dropped, becoming thick with emotion. "This man isn't a monster. He's a grandfather. He lost his home and his 7-year-old granddaughter Lily in the fire. Ash was her cat. And Lily's favorite doll is buried right down there, under all this rubble. She was telling their secret to the world, but it was the only way. Ash won't leave. He's been standing guard over his little girl's last memory for almost a year. And Joe has been standing guard over him. They're not hurting each other. They're all the family each other has left." Then, something in the stream of comments began to change. The angry emojis and cruel words slowed down. They were replaced by sad faces, by broken hearts. A single comment appeared. "He's blind? Oh my God." Then another. "A doll? He's been waiting for a doll?" The tide was turning. The simple, ugly story of a monster was being washed away by a complicated, beautiful story of love. The foreman in the bulldozer was watching her, his expression unreadable. She turned and looked directly at him, holding the phone up as if to show him the thousands of people who were now watching his every move. "Please," she said, her voice no longer just for the internet, but for him. "They just need to find it. They just need a chance to say goodbye." Maya looked at the screen of her phone. The angry emojis were vanishing. Instead, hearts were floating up the side of the screen. Thousands of them. "We are on our way," one comment read, then another. "Don't let them dig. We are coming." She turned to the foreman with tears in her eyes. "Wait," she said. "Please wait." The change was slow at first, then overwhelming, like a warm tide. The angry comments stopped, and soon cars began to pull up along the road. Neighbors, students, and strangers climbed over the fence, but they didn't bring stones this time. They brought shovels, gloves, and buckets. The bulldozer driver turned off his engine, climbed down, and silently joined the line of people. The foreman stared at Maya for a long, silent moment. Then he looked past her, at the road, where the first car had just pulled to a stop. A man got out, someone Maya recognized as one of the angriest shouters from the day before. He wasn't yelling now. He walked to the back of his truck, pulled out a shovel, and looked towards the ruin with an expression of deep regret. With a heavy sigh, the foreman reached up and turned the key. The bulldozer's engine sputtered and died. The sudden silence was a miracle. Soon, another car arrived, and then another. It was like a dam had broken. People were getting out of their cars and walking towards the fence, not with phones out, but with tools in their hands. A group of college students came with heavy work gloves. A woman arrived with a case of bottled water. An old woman brought a bag of sandwiches. They were the digital army, made real. No one spoke. There were no grand apologies, no speeches. There was only a quiet, shared understanding. They had all been part of the problem. Now, they all had a chance to be part of the solution. They started to file through the gap in the fence, their faces set with determination. The foreman watched them for a moment. Then he made a decision. He swung himself down from the high seat of his machine, walked over to his truck, and pulled out his own shovel. He walked over to Joe, who was still standing by the beam, looking utterly bewildered by the scene unfolding around him. "Where do we start?" the foreman asked, his voice gruff but respectful. Joe seemed unable to speak. He simply pointed a trembling finger at the large pile of debris next to the beam. That was all the direction the crowd needed. A man in a business suit took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and picked up a broken piece of concrete. He passed it to a teenage girl, who passed it to the foreman, who placed it gently on a growing pile near the fence. A human chain had formed. It was slow, difficult work. The debris was heavy and covered in a thick layer of grimy soot. But no one complained. They worked together, their movements becoming a steady, rhythmic dance of lifting and passing. The sound was no longer the roar of an engine, but the scrape of shovels, the soft thud of wood being stacked, and the quiet murmurs of people working towards a common goal. Maya stood to the side, handing out water bottles. She watched as the pile of rubble slowly began to shrink. She saw the neighbor who had thrown the first stone yesterday now working the hardest, his face dripping with sweat, his expression one of pure focus. He was not just clearing away bricks. He was trying to clear away his own mistake. Old Joe lowered his stick, his mouth open in shock. He watched as the town that had hated him yesterday now sweated beside him today. They formed a human chain, passing bricks from hand to hand. For the first time since the fire, the heavy weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't the only guardian anymore. For hours, hundreds of hands moved the black debris, piece by careful piece. Finally, a young boy shouted and lifted something small and dirty from the gray dust, a singed fabric doll. Joe took it with trembling hands and held it gently to the blind cat's nose. The cat sniffed, let out a long, soft sigh, and for the first time in months, the tension left his body. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the volunteers. Their faces were streaked with sweat and soot, but their energy never faded. They worked with a reverence, as if they were excavating a sacred site. Each piece of charred wood and broken plaster was moved with care, because no one knew which piece might be covering the treasure they were all searching for. Joe and Maya worked alongside them, their hands raw and blistered. Joe directed the effort, pointing to the areas where the bedroom floor had been. He moved with a purpose Maya hadn't seen before, his old body fueled by a new, fragile hope. Ash, the blind cat, remained on his beam, listening to the strange new sounds of his quiet world being taken apart. He was nervous, but the familiar scent of Joe nearby kept him calm. They had cleared a large area, reaching the blackened floorboards of what was once Lily's room. The work became even more delicate. People were on their hands and knees now, gently brushing away layers of dust and ash. The human chain was gone, replaced by a circle of silent, focused searchers. The only sound was the soft scraping of hands against burnt wood. "I think I have something." The voice was young and excited. It was a boy, no older than 10, who had come with his father. He was carefully pulling at a piece of dirty fabric wedged beneath a heavy, splintered plank. His father rushed over and helped him lift the plank away. And there it was. It was small and limp, barely recognizable. It was a simple rag doll, its yarn hair singed and its button eyes cloudy with grime. Its once bright yellow dress was now the color of a storm cloud, but it was intact. It had survived. The boy picked it up, as if it were made of glass, and carried it over to Joe. A hush fell over the entire group. Everyone stopped working and turned to watch. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. The boy held out the doll, and Joe took it with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold it steady. He stared at it, his face crumbling. All the pain he had held inside for so long finally overflowed, and silent tears streamed down his soot-stained cheeks. He clutched the doll to his chest. "Sunshine," he whispered. "Oh, Lily, we found her." Maya gently touched his arm. "Joe," she said softly, "let him see." Joe nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He knelt down in front of Ash, who had been sitting rigidly, his head turning back and forth, sensing the shift in the air. "Look, buddy," Joe whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Look who we found." He held the doll forward, right up to the blind cat's nose. Ash froze. His nose twitched once, then again, more frantically. He inhaled deeply, and a low, rumbling sound started deep in his chest. It was a sound Maya had never heard from him before, a mix between a purr and a groan. He knew that smell. It was the scent of laughter, of bedtime stories, of small arms wrapped around him in the dark. It was the scent of his girl. He pushed his face into the doll, rubbing his cheek against the dirty fabric again and again. Joe untied the rope with slow, deliberate fingers. The knot fell away. The cat didn't run in panic or confusion. He simply rubbed his head against Joe's leg, purring deeply. It was a sound of permission, a signal of peace. They had found what they were looking for. It was time to go home. 1 month later, the smell of smoke is just a memory. In a small, sunlit cottage, Joe sits in a comfortable armchair, reading a book. On the windowsill, the black cat sleeps soundly on a soft blue cushion, no longer needing a rope to keep him safe. Between them, on a special shelf, sits the little doll, watching over the family that love built from the ashes. The cottage was small, with cheerful yellow curtains and pots of flowers on the porch. The town, overcome with a desire to right its wrongs, had come together to find it for him. People had donated furniture, brought groceries, and planted a small garden in the backyard. It wasn't just charity, it was an apology, built with kindness and care. Joe looked like a different man. His face was clean, his hair was cut, and he wore a soft flannel shirt. The angry, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet calm. He still had moments of sadness, of course. Grief was not a ruin that could be cleared away in a day, but it was no longer a weight that crushed him. It was just a part of him now, a memory he carried with love instead of bitterness. Ash was transformed too. With regular food, a warm place to sleep, and a world without loud noises and flying stones, his black fur had become sleek and glossy. He was still blind, but he navigated the small cottage with a confident ease. He knew every table leg, every doorway, every patch of sunlight that moved across the floor during the day. His favorite spot was the wide windowsill in the living room, where he could feel the warmth of the sun and listen to the birds singing outside. On a small bookshelf next to Joe's chair was a little memorial. In the center, standing upright in a protective glass dome, was Sunshine, the raggedy doll. She had been gently cleaned, but the scorch marks on her dress remained, a reminder of all they had endured. Next to the doll was a framed photograph of a smiling, gap-toothed little girl with bright, happy eyes. It was Lily. The story of Mad Joe had become a local legend, but now it was told with a different ending. It was a story about not judging what you don't understand. It was a story about how a community had made a terrible mistake, but had then come together to make it right. The ruin was gone now. In its place, the town had planted a small memorial garden with a simple wooden bench and a single dogwood tree. Sometimes, in the afternoons, Joe would sit on that bench. Ash would be safely at home, but Joe would come to the spot where his old life had ended and his new one had, in a strange way, begun. He wouldn't stay long. He was no longer a guardian of the ashes. He was just a man visiting a memory. This afternoon, however, he was content to stay inside. He closed his book and looked over at the windowsill. Ash's one good ear twitched in his sleep. Joe smiled. The world had seen them as a monster and a victim, a madman and his prisoner. But they had always known the truth. They were just two survivors, waiting for a sign that it was okay to let go and start again. And in the end, love had shown them the way. Outside, the leaves are turning gold, but inside, it is warm. Joe picks up a framed photo of a smiling girl and places it next to the doll. He strokes the cat's sleeping head and smiles. They are not just survivors of the fire anymore. They are the keepers of the light.